Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The stranger in the car.
It was one of those long, silent nights when the streets seemed emptier than usual. I had just finished a grueling shift at the diner and was eager to get home. The city lights were dim, casting an orange haze over the deserted roads. I had barely driven a few blocks when I noticed a lone figure standing at a bus stop, bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering streetlight. At first, I thought it was just another person waiting for a bus that would never come, but as I got closer, I saw that this person was a man, and he didn't look like he was waiting calmly. His clothes were disheveled and stained, and he appeared to be in a state of distress. I felt a pang of sympathy mixed with caution. As I slowed down, he hurriedly approached my car. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to hear him clearly but not enough for him to reach inside. "Please," he said urgently, his voice trembling, "can you give me a ride to the city? I need to get there as fast as possible. It's really important." I hesitated, my instincts warning me to be cautious. The area was deserted, and picking up a stranger at this hour seemed risky. But there was something in his eyes, desperation and fear, that made it hard to say no. I took a deep breath and made the decision to let him in, hoping that my instincts were wrong and that I was just being overly cautious. He climbed into the passenger seat, his movements hurried and jittery. I could see his hands shaking as he settled into the seat, and the air in the car felt thicker, charged with an unsettling tension. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge the situation. "Thank you," he said, still looking nervously out the window. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I need to get to the city. It's really urgent." As I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's anxiety was palpable, and the silence between us was heavy. I tried to make small talk to break the ice, but he seemed too preoccupied, too lost in his own thoughts. The night was growing darker, and the road stretched out ahead, isolated and empty. I had no idea what I had gotten myself into, but I knew that I couldn't turn back now. The journey to the city seemed endless, and the presence of this stranger made the night feel even more foreboding. The miles ticked away in silence, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind outside to break the quiet. The man sitting next to me seemed lost in his own world, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, scanning the darkened landscape. I could sense the tension building, and the silence was beginning to grate on my nerves. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I felt anything but. "You seem really on edge." He glanced at me, his face pale under the dim light of the car's interior. "It's just, things have been really strange lately. I don't know how to explain it, but there've been some incidents. People are disappearing, strange things are happening, and I'm scared." His voice was barely above a whisper, and the way he spoke made my skin crawl. "What kind of incidents?" I asked, trying to understand what he was talking about. He swallowed hard, and his eyes flicked nervously to the window. "There have been reports of people vanishing from their homes, people just disappearing without a trace. And there's this feeling, like something is watching you, something you can't see but can feel." I could feel a chill running down my spine as he spoke. The stories he was telling were eerily similar to rumors I had heard around town, but had always dismissed as exaggerated tales. Now, hearing them from someone so visibly shaken made them feel all too real. "Why do you think this is happening?" I asked, though part of me didn't really want to know the answer. He looked at me, his expression grim. "I don't know. I think whatever it is, it's trying to lure people in. There's something about the way it works, like it's drawing people to it. I was trying to get to the police station to report it, but my phone died, and I got stuck at that bus stop." The car seemed to grow colder as he spoke, and the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. I glanced at the dashboard clock. How had we already been driving for so long? The roads were deserted, and the familiar city lights seemed to be fading into the distance. As I tried to make sense of what he was saying, the man suddenly stiffened beside me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's getting closer," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I can feel it." I could feel my own anxiety rising. The shadows outside the car seemed to move more erratically, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. The idea that something might be following us, or worse, that we were driving straight into danger, was almost too much to bear. The silence that followed was suffocating. I glanced at the man, who was now staring intently out the window, and then back at the road ahead, trying to keep my focus. Every sound outside seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to hold something sinister. I was starting to doubt my decision to give him a ride, but there was no turning back now. The car ride felt like it was stretching into eternity. The man beside me was now visibly trembling, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The tension in the vehicle was almost unbearable, and I could feel a growing sense of dread that seemed to seep into my bones. The streetlights outside flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something sinister was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The man's increasing panic only heightened my own fears. "You mentioned something about being followed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there any specific reason you think that's happening?" He turned to me, his eyes wide and filled with a desperate intensity. "It's not just about being followed. It's like something is reaching into your mind, making you see things that aren't there. It's trying to get inside your head." His words sent another shiver down my spine. I glanced around, trying to spot anything unusual, but the road remained eerily empty. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the car and the distant howling of the wind. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping noise, like something, or someone, was hitting the car from the outside. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly glanced in the rear-view mirror. There was nothing but darkness, and the tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The man's face turned a shade paler, if that was even possible. "It's them. They know we're getting close. They're trying to make us turn back." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I was beginning to question my sanity, or rather, my decision to continue this ride. The sense of foreboding was almost palpable, and I could feel the walls of the car closing in on me. Just as I was about to suggest we turn around, the man suddenly gasped, pointing out the window. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the darkness. It was hard to make out details, but the silhouette seemed to be moving slowly, almost gliding along the road. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to make out what I was seeing. The figure was tall and shadowy, and it seemed to be coming closer. I could feel my pulse racing, and the air in the car grew colder. The man beside me began muttering frantically, "It's them. It's really them. We need to get out of here now." I accelerated, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure seemed to keep pace with the car, never getting closer but always remaining in our peripheral vision. My eyes darted between the road and the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. As we continued driving, the figure eventually faded into the darkness, but the fear remained. The man was now practically shaking, clutching the seat as if it were a lifeline. The oppressive atmosphere in the car was almost too much to bear, and I could feel my own anxiety rising. I had to get us to the city, but the roads were still desolate, and the sense of being followed was becoming overwhelming. The shadows outside seemed to stretch and writhe, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving straight into a trap. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly as we continued down the desolate road. The eerie silence inside the car was broken only by the occasional whisper of the man beside me, his voice trembling with fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and my anxiety was reaching a fever pitch. "Why aren't we there yet?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration and fear. "We should have reached the city by now." The man's eyes darted around nervously. "It's not just the distance. It's something else. It's as if we're caught in a loop. I've heard stories about this. People driving the same stretch of road over and over, unable to escape." My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I glanced at the road ahead. The familiar landmarks I had expected to see were nowhere in sight. Instead, the road seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember. The city lights that should have been getting closer were nowhere to be seen. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I felt a growing sense of dread. "You're saying we're stuck in some kind of loop?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like we're being kept here, like something is preventing us from reaching the city. We're not alone out here. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. The sensation of being trapped was suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the car's exterior. The noise was subtle but persistent, adding to the growing sense of dread. I tried to focus on the road, but the darkness outside seemed to close in around us. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. My heart raced as I glanced at the man, who was now staring at the window with wide, terrified eyes. "What do you mean, not alone?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "There's something out there," he said, his voice quivering. "It's like a presence, something that feeds on fear. It's been following us ever since we picked me up. I tried to warn you, but..." Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. My heart skipped a beat as the car began to lose power. I struggled to keep it under control, but the vehicle seemed to be moving of its own accord, slowing down despite my efforts to accelerate. "Stay calm," I told the man, though my own voice was barely steady. "We need to find a way out of this." But as I glanced around, I saw that the road seemed to be dissolving into an endless stretch of darkness. The familiar road signs and landmarks were gone, replaced by an oppressive black void. The car's interior was growing colder, and the scraping noise outside became louder, more insistent. The man's breathing was rapid and shallow, and he kept muttering to himself, trying to calm his own fears. "It's not supposed to be like this," he kept repeating. "We shouldn't be here." My own fears were becoming overwhelming, and the sense of helplessness was almost too much to bear. I had no idea what was happening, but it was clear that we were no longer on a normal road. Whatever was out there was making sure we remained trapped in this nightmarish loop, and there was no escaping it. The car continued to lurch forward, its headlights flickering erratically as if struggling against some unseen force. My anxiety was at a breaking point, and the oppressive darkness outside felt like it was closing in on us. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, and the scraping sound against the car grew louder and more menacing. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There has to be a way out of this loop." The man beside me looked more terrified than ever, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "It's no use," he said, shaking his head. "Whatever it is, it won't let us leave. We're trapped here." My mind raced as I tried to think of any possible escape. I checked the GPS on my phone, but the screen was blank. The radio was dead, and there was no signal on my cell phone. We were utterly isolated, cut off from the outside world. Suddenly, a dark shape appeared in front of the car, materializing out of the darkness. It was a figure, tall and shadowy, moving with an unnatural grace. The figure's presence was both terrifying and mesmerizing, and I could feel an almost tangible sense of dread emanating from it. The man beside me gasped. "That's it. That's what's been following us." I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The figure stood still, its form shifting and contorting in the darkness. I could barely make out its features, but its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with an eerie, malevolent light. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. The man's face was a mask of terror. "We have to confront it. It feeds on fear. The more we show fear, the stronger it becomes." With a shaky breath, I opened the car door and stepped out into the cold night air. The figure seemed to react to my movement, its form growing more defined and its eyes glowing brighter. The man followed, his steps hesitant but determined. As we approached the figure, I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread pressing down on us. The air felt thick and oppressive, and the temperature seemed to drop sharply. The figure loomed over us, its presence almost suffocating. "Show no fear," the man whispered urgently. "It feeds on fear. If you show it that you're not afraid, it might lose its power." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look at the figure without flinching. The figure's eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt a wave of fear trying to engulf me. But I clenched my fists and held my ground, determined not to let it overwhelm me. The figure's form began to waver, its glowing eyes flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. I could feel the pressure in the air easing, and the darkness around us seemed to recede. The oppressive feeling that had been hanging over us began to lift, and the figure started to dissolve into the shadows. With a final shuddering sigh, The figure vanished completely, leaving us standing alone in the darkness. The air felt lighter, and the cold seemed to dissipate. The road ahead looked normal again, with familiar landmarks and city lights appearing in the distance. I turned to the man, who was breathing heavily but seemed relieved. "Is it over?" I asked. He nodded, his expression one of exhausted relief. "I think so. We broke the loop. We should be able to get to the city now." I climbed back into the car, and the engine roared to life as if it had been waiting for us to break free. As I drove towards the city, the road seemed to stretch out ahead, no longer distorted or twisted. The sense of dread that had been suffocating us was gone, replaced by a cautious relief. We made it to the city, and as I dropped the man off at his destination, he thanked me with a shaky voice and a grateful look. I watched him disappear into the night before driving away, my mind still reeling from the night's events. I don't know what that thing was or why it targeted us, but I'm grateful we made it out alive. The experience left a lasting mark on me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. I hope I never have to face something like that again.
The night at the motel.
I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. The sun had set long ago, and I was desperate for a place to rest. The small motel on the outskirts of town appeared like a beacon in the darkness. Its neon sign flickered erratically, casting an uneven glow across the empty parking lot. I pulled into a spot and dragged myself into the office. The inside was dimly lit and smelled faintly of stale coffee. The clerk behind the counter looked up from a newspaper, his tired eyes meeting mine. He gave me a small, forced smile as he reached for a key. "Room 12, he said, handing over a tarnished brass key. "You're the only guest tonight. It's quiet around here." I nodded and took the key, feeling a twinge of unease at the clerk's words but brushing it aside. I just wanted to get to my room and collapse onto a bed. As I made my way to room 12, the hallway was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The room was nothing to write home about. Old furniture, a musty smell, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. I locked the door behind me and threw my suitcase onto the floor, already feeling the weariness of the day settling over me. The room had a small window, and I drew the curtains to block out the darkness. I was just about to lie down when I heard a faint noise coming from the corridor outside, an odd, rhythmic thumping. My mind raced, trying to place the sound. It was probably just the building settling or maybe someone else checking in. I tried to dismiss it and focus on the comfort of the bed, but sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, the noise outside growing more pronounced. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. I got up and peeked through the peephole on the door, but the hallway was empty, shrouded in darkness. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I returned to bed, but sleep was elusive. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with a mixture of fatigue and unease. Outside the window, I thought I saw shadows moving, but I couldn't be sure. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. As the hours ticked by, the thumping sound returned, louder and more insistent. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or the quirks of an old building, but the growing sense of dread was impossible to ignore. I lay there, wide awake, wondering what kind of place I had ended up in. The thumping in the hallway was relentless. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to shake off the growing unease. Every so often, the noise would stop, only to start up again with a rhythmic persistence that made it clear it wasn't random. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. At around midnight, the noises seemed to escalate. The thumping grew louder and was now accompanied by what sounded like soft scraping noises, as if someone, or something, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I could no longer ignore it. My heart pounded as I slid out of bed and crept toward the door. I hesitated before opening it, my hand trembling as I turned the handle. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, the flickering overhead lights casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I peered through the peephole, trying to make sense of the eerie silence outside. The hallway was empty, but the darkness felt oppressive, almost as if it was hiding something. I took a deep breath and stepped out cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The sounds had stopped, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the creaking of the old building. I walked slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I approached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to room 11 was slightly ajar. The idea of someone else being in the motel was unsettling, but curiosity, and the need to find out what was going on, overcame my fear. I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was dark and seemingly empty, with nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something odd. A faint, yellowish light coming from the small, barely visible closet. The light flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I took a step closer, my flashlight illuminating the closet. The light was coming from an old, dusty lamp sitting on a small table. It was as if someone had been in there, but the room was otherwise untouched. I could feel a chill run down my spine as I wondered who could have been here. Suddenly, I heard a loud creak behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was still empty. My nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was being watched. I hurried back to my room, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just seen. As I returned to room 12, I glanced through the window and noticed more shadows moving outside. The shapes were indistinct, but their presence was unnerving. I closed the curtains tightly, trying to block out the unsettling view. I lay back on the bed, my mind racing. The noises, the shadows, and the strange light in the adjacent room were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't seem to solve. The motel's silence felt like a deceptive calm before a storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Sleep was elusive, and I lay there wide awake, every creak and groan of the building amplifying my anxiety. The sense of dread was growing stronger, and I felt like I was caught in a web of fear and uncertainty. As the hours passed, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the motel might be hiding, and whether I was about to uncover them. By the time dawn began to break, I was still unable to sleep. The silence of the motel was stifling, and the shadows outside seemed to taunt me. With the rising sun providing some semblance of normalcy, I decided I needed to get to the bottom of what was happening. I couldn't stay in this state of unease any longer. I mustered the courage to step out of my room once again. The hallway was still eerily quiet, and the flickering lights overhead cast a sickly glow on the worn-out carpet. My footsteps felt unusually loud in the silence as I walked toward the reception area. The clerk from earlier was nowhere to be found, which only added to my growing anxiety. I decided to check out the old storage room I had seen earlier, the one with the slightly ajar door. The door creaked open as I approached it, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with dusty old furniture and boxes. The storage room was dark, but my flashlight cut through the gloom. As I rifled through the boxes, I came across a stack of old newspapers and magazines. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began flipping through the pages. The articles were yellowed with age, but one headline caught my eye: Mysterious Disappearances at Quiet Motel. I read the article with growing horror. It detailed a series of disappearances that had plagued the motel in the 1970s. The police had been baffled by the cases, and the article spoke of strange occurrences and unsettling reports from guests. My heart raced as I realized that the motel had a history of violence and mystery, something I hadn't expected when I first checked in. One article described a former owner who had been involved in a series of violent crimes. It mentioned that he had vanished without a trace, and many believed he had never left the property. Another article detailed the bizarre behavior of some guests who had reported seeing ghostly figures and hearing disembodied voices. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The shadows I had seen outside, the strange noises, it all started to make a twisted sort of sense. This wasn't just a case of an old building settling or a few harmless quirks. There was something far more sinister at play. As I continued to read, the door to the storage room suddenly slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I jumped, my flashlight flickering and almost going out. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own rapid breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open again, and I stumbled out into the hallway. My hands were shaking as I tried to calm myself. The information I had uncovered was horrifying, but I knew I couldn't stay in the motel any longer. I needed to leave, but the dread of what I had discovered made it feel like the walls of the motel were closing in on me. With a sense of urgency, I returned to my room to pack my things. I was determined to leave this nightmare behind. But as I looked out the window once more, I saw the shadows outside had become more pronounced, almost as if they were moving closer to the motel. The sense of impending doom was overwhelming. I grabbed my suitcase, my hands trembling as I prepared to check out and escape this place. I couldn't shake the feeling that the motel was trying to keep me there, that something, or someone, was determined to ensure I never left. As I headed for the front desk, the once comforting morning light now seemed distorted and menacing. The motel's dark history had come alive, and I had to get out before it claimed me too. My heart was racing as I hurried to the front desk to check out. The motel's lobby was still deserted, and the clerk from earlier was nowhere to be found. I felt a pang of anxiety, realizing that I was alone in this unsettling place. I glanced around, feeling the weight of the motel's sinister history pressing down on me. I moved quickly, grabbing my suitcase and heading for the door. But as I approached, the eerie calmness of the lobby was shattered by a sudden loud bang from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to see what had caused the noise. The hallway seemed darker than before, the lights flickering erratically. With a sense of foreboding, I opened the door to the outside. The morning light was harsh and unwelcoming, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I took a deep breath and stepped outside, but as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands slick with sweat. As I unlocked the door and threw my suitcase into the back seat, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At the end of the parking lot, a figure stood by the motel entrance. It was too far away to make out any details, but it seemed to be watching me. I quickly got into the car and started the engine, my eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. The figure was still there, watching with an unsettling stillness. I backed out of my parking spot and drove down the empty road, my mind racing with the events of the past few hours. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the isolation of the area making me feel even more vulnerable. I glanced at the clock. My sense of time was distorted, as if I had been trapped in the motel's dark grip for longer than I realized. As I drove, I began to notice that the landscape around me seemed oddly familiar. The same trees, the same road signs. It was as if I was driving in circles, no matter which direction I took. Panic set in as I realized that I wasn't making any progress. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. The feeling of being trapped intensified as the road and the motel's looming presence seemed to merge into one. I was stuck in a loop, and no matter how many turns I made, I kept ending up back at the motel. Desperation took over as I turned into the parking lot once again. The figure I had seen earlier was now much closer, standing at the edge of the motel's entrance. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and my pulse raced as I drove past the figure, trying to ignore the feeling of its gaze on me. I parked the car and took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. The shadows outside seemed darker, more menacing. The motel loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty. I knew I had to find a way out, but the sense of dread was almost paralyzing. As I stepped out of the car, the door to the storage room creaked open by itself. I could see the faint glow of the old lamp from inside. My flashlight, which had been on the dashboard, flickered back to life on its own. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the air grew colder. The figure at the entrance began to move toward me, its form shifting and wavering in the dim light. I took one last look at the motel, the shadows outside seeming to close in around me. I had to escape, but the motel seemed determined to keep me there, to trap me in its dark history forever. I turned and ran toward my car, hoping to break free from the nightmare that had become my reality. As I sped away, the motel and its haunting presence faded into the distance, but the fear and anxiety remained, a chilling reminder of the terror I had endured. My heart pounded as I drove away from the motel, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear and confusion. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the isolation of the area felt like a never-ending nightmare. Despite my desperate attempts to escape, the sense of dread never fully left me. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie light over the landscape. I could see familiar landmarks, but they seemed to morph and shift with each passing mile. The feeling of being trapped in a loop was growing stronger. No matter how far I drove, it felt like I was always being pulled back to the motel. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to set in. I had driven for so long that I lost track of time. Every turn and every road sign seemed to taunt me with the promise of freedom, only to lead me back to the same terrifying location. It was as if the motel had become a part of my very reality, a dark shadow that I couldn't escape. At one point, I noticed a sign indicating a town up ahead. I was filled with a surge of hope. Maybe there was someone there who could help me. I followed the sign, but as I entered the town, I realized with horror that it was eerily deserted. The streets were empty, and the buildings were in disrepair. It was as if I had stumbled into a ghost town. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. I got out of the car and wandered through the empty streets, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The town seemed to be frozen in time. Its inhabitants vanished without a trace. In the center of town stood an old, abandoned building with a faded sign that read, "Welcome to the Quiet Motel." My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the motel I had tried so hard to escape from was now staring me in the face, reappearing in a place I thought was safe. It was as if it had followed me, no matter how far I went. I approached the building with a mixture of dread and resignation. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The familiar smell of stale air and old furniture hit me immediately. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that the motel's dark grip was still holding me. Inside, the lobby was just as I remembered it, old and decrepit, with the same flickering lights and musty smell. But something was different. A figure stood behind the reception desk, the same clerk I had seen before. His eyes were vacant, and his expression was eerily calm. "You can't leave," he said softly, his voice sending chills down my spine. "You're part of the motel now." The words echoed in my mind, and I felt a sense of hopelessness wash over me. I was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, unable to escape the motel's dark influence. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming, and I realized that the motel had become a part of me, a haunting presence that I could never truly escape. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The figure at the desk disappeared into the shadows, and the lights flickered wildly. The familiar thumping sound from earlier returned, echoing through the empty halls. I was caught in a never-ending loop of terror, unable to break free from the motel's grip. As I wandered through the darkened corridors, I saw the shadows moving once more, their forms shifting and stretching in the dim light. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the sense of being watched was more intense than ever. The motel's dark history had become my reality, a relentless nightmare that I couldn't escape. In the end, I realized that the motel had claimed me, and there was no escaping its dark embrace. The shadows would forever haunt me, and the terror of the motel would remain a part of my existence. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and despair, a prisoner of the motel's unending darkness.
The Road Passenger.
It was one of those nights where the road stretched out endlessly, a dark and monotonous ribbon of asphalt winding through the heart of nowhere. My name is Emily, and I'd been driving for what felt like forever, my eyes growing heavier with each mile. I was a freelance graphic designer, which meant long hours and even longer drives between clients. It was late, and I was running on pure exhaustion and the hope of finally reaching a motel where I could crash for a few hours. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the empty road ahead. The radio was off, the silence only broken by the low hum of the engine. I was so tired that I could barely keep my eyes open. That's when I saw him. A man was standing by the side of the road, drenched and looking like he'd been there for a while. He was holding a sign that read, "Help." I knew I should have kept driving, but the thought of someone stranded out here alone, especially in the middle of the night, tugged at my conscience. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I called out, trying to sound as casual as possible. The man, who introduced himself as Greg, climbed into the passenger seat with a sigh of relief. I couldn't help but notice how calm he seemed, considering the circumstances. He looked like he'd been through a lot, but he carried an air of unsettling tranquility. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he settled into the seat. I was starting to lose hope. I wasn't sure if anyone would come by. "No problem," I replied, trying to mask my growing unease. "Where are you headed?" He gave me an address for a town that was still quite a distance away. We exchanged some small talk, and I learned that he was supposedly from out of town and was just trying to get back home. But as the drive continued, I started to notice something strange. Greg's questions were becoming increasingly personal. Questions about my family, my job, and even details about my last few clients. I hadn't shared any of this with him, so how did he know? "Do you live alone?" he asked casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I gave him a polite, but guarded answer. Yes, just me and my cat. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, but there was something in his gaze that made me uneasy. It was as if he was scrutinizing me, probing for information that he shouldn't have known. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road, but the more he spoke, the more I felt a chill creeping over me. When I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, I saw a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It was unsettling. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but something about Greg's calm demeanor and probing questions made my skin crawl. Despite my growing discomfort, I decided to push through. After all, I was already committed to this drive, and it was too late to turn back. Little did I know that this seemingly benign act of kindness was about to take me down a road far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As the hours dragged on, I tried to focus on the road, but Greg's questions were becoming increasingly invasive. It was as though he was trying to dig into the deepest parts of my life, and his knowledge of me felt disturbingly accurate. He knew details I had never shared with anyone. "Do you have any siblings?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I have a brother," I replied, trying to keep the conversation as brief as possible. "He lives on the West Coast." Greg nodded, seemingly interested. "You must miss him. It's tough being so far apart, especially with how close you two are." I froze, taken aback. I had mentioned my brother only in passing to a few friends, and none of them knew about our close relationship. I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The conversation shifted, and Greg began talking about my work. He seemed to know specifics about the projects I'd been working on. "I saw your work online," he said casually. "You did a fantastic job with that redesign for the charity event. It's been getting a lot of attention." I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I had indeed worked on that project, but I had never mentioned it to him. It was unnerving how much he seemed to know about me. I forced a smile and tried to redirect the conversation, but Greg's probing continued, becoming more personal with each question. "I've been following your career for a while," Greg said with a disarming ease. "You've made some interesting choices lately. I think you're on the right path, though." It was as if he had been keeping tabs on me for months, but I couldn't fathom why. My attempts to steer the conversation to safer topics were met with polite nods and then a return to more unsettling questions. It felt like he was deliberately pushing my boundaries. When I decided it was time to stop for a break, I pulled into a small diner I spotted up ahead. I thought that if I could just get out of the car and get some fresh air, I might be able to clear my head and reassess the situation. "I'll be right back," I said, trying to sound casual. "I just need to grab some coffee." Greg stayed in the car, a curious look in his eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me even as I walked away. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Inside the diner, I sipped my coffee and tried to calm my nerves. The waitress gave me a concerned look, probably noticing my frazzled state, but I brushed it off. I just needed to get back on the road and finish the trip. When I returned to the car, Greg was still sitting there, seemingly relaxed. The questions started up again as soon as we were back on the road, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary ride. It was becoming clear that Greg was no ordinary passenger. He was delving into parts of my life that I kept private, and the more I tried to distance myself, the more it felt like he was weaving himself into my life in ways I couldn't escape. I decided to cut the ride short, finding a place to stop and ask him to get out. But when I mentioned it, he just smiled faintly and said, "I'm not ready to leave yet. Besides, we still have a ways to go." His words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if he was determined to stay by my side, no matter what. As I tried to find a way out of this situation, I began to realize that the road ahead was not just long. It was becoming a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As I drove away from the diner, the darkness outside seemed to press in even more, and the weight of Greg's unsettling presence was heavier than ever. I hoped that getting back on the road would shake off the eerie feeling, but the road stretched out endlessly, and my attempts to escape were futile. I tried to focus on the GPS, but the screen seemed to be glitching, showing strange routes and empty spaces where there should have been towns and landmarks. It felt as if the GPS was mocking me, displaying a map that refused to lead me to safety. "Is everything all right?" Greg's voice interrupted my thoughts. He had a calm, almost too calm demeanor, as if he were completely unfazed by the growing tension in the car. Yeah, just a bit of technical trouble, I said, forcing a smile. I'm sure it will sort itself out. I decided to take a different route, hoping it would lead me to a different road or perhaps a more populated area. The miles rolled on, but nothing changed. No towns appeared on the horizon, and the road seemed to loop back on itself. Every turn I made brought me right back to the same stretch of highway I'd been on before. Panic began to set in as I realized that no matter which way I turned, I ended up right back where I started. It was like I was trapped in a never-ending loop, with the same dark landscape stretching out in front of me. The familiar landmarks I passed became eerie and unsettling, like déjà vu gone horribly wrong. Why does it feel like we're going in circles? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Greg simply smiled and shrugged. Sometimes the road has a way of showing us things we're not ready to see. His words made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him and continued driving, hoping for a miracle. I even pulled over to check the map, but the same unsettling feeling persisted. The road was unchanging, the landscape devoid of any sign of civilization. Desperation set in. I attempted to change routes again, but as soon as I took a turn, I found myself right back at the same spot. The horizon remained dark and unyielding, mocking my attempts to escape. Greg's presence in the passenger seat was a constant reminder of my growing helplessness. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Greg's gaze was unsettlingly calm. "I'm not doing anything. The road is simply reflecting what's in your heart." Frustration boiled over. I pulled over once more, hoping that if I stopped the car, I might be able to gather my thoughts and figure out what was going on. But as I sat in the car, Greg's words echoed in my mind, and the isolation of the road began to feel like a prison. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The area was eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt like the world had vanished, leaving me and Greg trapped in this endless looping nightmare. My attempts to leave became increasingly frantic. I even tried to abandon the car and walk, but every time I ventured into the darkness, I found myself right back on the road, in the same spot, with Greg waiting patiently for me. With each passing hour, the reality of my situation became more horrifying. I was trapped in an unending loop, and Greg seemed to be the only constant in this twisted ordeal. The road was no longer just a path to my destination. It had become a labyrinth of fear and despair, and I couldn't escape its clutches. As the night wore on, my anxiety reached new heights. The same stretch of road loomed ahead, taunting me with its monotony. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and my attempts to break free from the endless loop were becoming increasingly desperate. In a fit of frustration, I decided to confront Greg directly. "What's going on? Why can't I get out of here?" I demanded, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. Greg's gaze remained unervingly calm. Sometimes, the road doesn't let you go until you confront what you're trying to escape. I was about to argue when I noticed a strange noise coming from the engine. My car had started to sputter and stutter, and before I knew it, it came to a halt in the middle of the road. Panic surged through me as I tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. We were stranded. "I'm going to check what's wrong," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I got out of the car and popped the hood, hoping to find something simple that I could fix. Greg remained in the car, and his silence was more disturbing than any words he could have said. The darkness seemed to close in around me as I examined the engine, but everything looked normal. I couldn't find any obvious problems, and the silence of the night was oppressive. As I stood there, I started to hear soft, unsettling whispers in the wind, like faint voices murmuring just out of reach. I turned around, half expecting to see someone or something, but the road was as empty as ever. My heart raced as I realized how isolated I was. When I finally returned to the car, Greg was still sitting there, looking as if nothing had happened. "Do you know what's wrong with the car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady.
"No," Greg replied smoothly.
But sometimes, the road reflects our inner turmoil. Maybe it's not just the car that's broken. I was growing increasingly desperate. I needed to get out of this situation, and the car's breakdown seemed like the final straw. I decided to leave the car and walk for help, hoping that if I could just get far enough away, I might be able to find a way out. As I started walking down the road, the darkness felt suffocating. My steps were the only sounds in the eerie silence, and I felt a growing sense of dread with every step I took. It was as if the road itself was fighting against me, pushing me back to where I had started. I walked for what felt like hours, but no matter how far I went, I found myself back at the car. It was like some cruel trick of fate. Every time I turned around, Greg was waiting, his calm demeanor now replaced with a knowing smile. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was trapped in a nightmarish loop, with no way to escape. I was forced to confront the truth that Greg was not just a passenger but a part of this twisted, endless journey. In a moment of desperation, I demanded answers. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" Greg's expression darkened, and he leaned closer. "I'm someone who's been waiting for you to see the truth. The road reveals more than just directions. It shows what's hidden inside." Suddenly, everything became clear. Greg wasn't just a stranger on the road. He was a manifestation of my deepest fears and regrets. This whole ordeal was a twisted reflection of my own internal struggles, and the endless loop was a nightmare of my own making. I had to confront not just Greg, but the fears that had been tormenting me all along. The road, the endless drive, and the creepy passenger were all parts of a psychological trap that I had to escape within myself. I realized that escaping the loop meant facing the truth about my own fears and anxieties. The journey wasn't just a physical one, it was a psychological ordeal that I had to navigate to find my way out. The realization that Greg was a manifestation of my own fears hit me like a tidal wave. I was no longer just trying to escape a physical loop, I was grappling with the darkest corners of my mind. I needed to confront these fears head-on if I had any hope of breaking free. I took a deep breath and turned to Greg, who was still sitting calmly in the passenger seat, watching me with a knowing look. "I understand now," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You're not just a passenger. You're a part of my fears. And if I'm going to get out of this, I need to face them." Greg's expression shifted to one of approval, but the smile never left his lips. "It's about time," he said softly. "Facing your fears is the only way to escape this cycle." I closed my eyes and began to mentally confront the fears that had plagued me. I thought about my anxieties, my regrets, and the things I had been running from in my life. Each fear felt like a dark shadow, creeping up and pulling me back into the loop. But I had to face them. With every breath, I visualized myself confronting each fear, standing up to the doubts and insecurities that had been holding me back. I imagined myself breaking free from the constraints they imposed on my life. It was a battle within my mind, but I was determined to win. As I worked through these fears, I started to feel a shift. The oppressive darkness that had enveloped the road began to lighten. The once endless stretch of highway seemed to change subtly, as if the road itself was responding to my mental struggle. I could see faint lights in the distance, and the road began to straighten out, breaking free from its unnerving loop. I looked over at Greg, who was now watching me with a sense of calm acceptance. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "I think I'm starting to understand." Greg nodded, and his calm demeanor seemed to dissolve into the night. "The road will show you what you need to see. It's up to you to take the lessons and move forward." With newfound determination, I turned my attention back to the road. The endless loop had finally broken, and I saw a sign for a town just ahead. It was a beacon of hope, and I accelerated toward it with a sense of relief. The road that had once felt like a prison now felt like a path to freedom. I was finally breaking free from the cycle, and the town ahead promised a new beginning. The eerie silence of the night had lifted, replaced by the comforting sounds of a more familiar world. As I drove into the town, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Greg was gone, his unsettling presence no longer a part of my journey. I was alone on the road, but it was a different road now, a road that led to a brighter future. I pulled into a well-lit motel, finally able to relax. The ordeal had been terrifying and exhausting, but it had taught me an important lesson. Facing my fears and confronting my inner struggles had been the key to breaking free from the nightmare. I knew that I would never forget the night I spent driving with a roadside passenger, but I also knew that I had emerged stronger from the experience. The road ahead was now mine to navigate, and I was ready to face whatever came next with a renewed sense of courage and resilience.